and unreligious knuckleheads. There's a lot of people who they've never been taught one way or the other about God and don't really care. There's got to be a God. Everyone says there is. Shit, it's in our Pledge of Allegiance. There's obviously a God, but I don't know. I'm just going to the mall. Do you want to go to the mall with me? A lot of that's in America too. So it needs to be helped. But it is the bastion of civilization today. I thought it had Western Europe on its side, but Western Europe has succumbed to another dark age. They have areas that are not subject to the rule of law anymore. So, continuing. Skipping down a bit, page 99. American history is largely an account of the advancement of freedom through armed conflict. The American Revolution, the Civil War. That's where he stops. But I would add World War I and World War II. And I would even add the Korean War. I would put the Vietnam War in there with certain restrictions. I have to stop with the Iraq War because it was so ineptly executed. By contrast, though, Western Europeans owe their freedom to liberation from the Nazis in World War II. They owe their liberation from Nazis to somebody else. America has a mentality in its history of saving itself, not Western Europe. They've learned to lump that war, the war against the Nazis, in with the preceding centuries of pointless European combat that did nothing but wreak death and destruction. So as far as they see it, it's all war, and now they live in a golden age with no war. But they've never discovered the reasons for that. Given that the horror of World War II was a more immediate reality for Europeans than for Americans, and that those living in the Cold War's front lines felt more vulnerable than those across the ocean, it's not surprising that we've ended up drawing two vastly different morals from World War II. For Americans, the moral was that tyranny was evil and must always be resisted. For Europeans, the moral was that war itself was evil and must be avoided at all costs. Now, the same evidence was available to both of us. They just saw some more horrible stuff. You would think that that would give them a more gusto appreciation for freedom and say, we'll never let freedom be challenged again, not even a little bit. You'd think so, but so you could this guy's rationalizing, saying the reason that they're not in favor of freedom, the reason that they'll compromise, is because they saw so much horror in World War II. If that were true, then America might have stepped down after 9/11 and said, all this blood is making us faint, we can't fight anymore. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. The reason they submit is because of Marxism. But that aside, I thank him for the evidence he brings us. Now, there were groups of people in Western Europe, social democrats he calls them here. He says, quote, they once soft-pedaled the sins of Soviet communism because it was the world's leading alternative to American-style capitalism. They didn't want to denigrate communism because it's the only option. And if it's not communism, it's capitalism. Don't want to be a capitalist, for God's sakes. So now they wink at the intolerances of Islam, today's alternative. And they allow things in Islam that they would not. They stand up and they teach in school about the liberation of women, about women's rights and suffrage, and the women got the vote and how oppressed they were. And the fact that women are beaten and have to wear sheets over their heads in Muslim countries doesn't faze them. You know, if this didn't give you pause yet, it's given a lot of people pause about the left. Do they really believe that the things they're saying are right? Could they, honestly? Is it possible? It should give you pause about it and say, you know, everyone says, well, everyone does what they believe is right. But I don't believe that's true. History doesn't demonstrate that. So they wink at the intolerances of today's Islam. Recognizing this, European Muslims, despite their social conservatism, increasingly vote for socialist parties, the atheists. In a Spectator article about this, doesn't politics make for strange bedfellows? In a Spectator article about this growing leftist Muslim alignment, which he calls the Black-Red Alliance, Douglas Davis writes that Socialist Workers' Party leaders quote, enforced gender segregation at a demonstration in Trafalgar Square, end quote, and, quote, ordered socialist women to cover their heads while demonstrating with their Muslim sisters outside the Israeli embassy in London. Such is the current state of liberal values on the European left. They do not want to liberate anybody. They don't want freedom. They don't want wealth. They want destruction. I've said that before when I said altruism equals mysticism. I said throughout that if the idea that altruism means goodwill towards others or any good values for anybody at all, if that idea is in your head, get it out of your head. Altruism does not consist of doing good to anybody or for anything. Altruism consists of irrationality. Irrationality in any form. But it's got to be irrational. And that means destruction. Destruction to life. You get it out of your head that altruism means anything benign, because it doesn't. We've been so long, we better skip down a bit here. There's a problem with anti-Semitism in Europe. Would you believe it? Would you believe they didn't learn from World War II? Would you believe it? It's been very, very quiet over the last half century. But more and more they have a reason to speak out against it. I was baffled, and have been up until just recently, about the rift between people who accuse Israel of being the problem in the Middle East and who accuse the Palestinians or the Arabs of being the problem. Because I watched like a 7-hour documentary on the history of Israel. And they fought very bravely in the teeth of extraordinary aggression from society 10 or 15 times or 20 times the size of the number of Jews that were there, and defended their country and even took land from the aggressors. And it's a story of heroism. So I was, for a long time, just couldn't understand it. And I think it's got to just basically be anti-Semitism. Old tradition. There's a lot of Europeans that probably aren't too upset about the fact that a lot of Jews got hauled away. And so we're going to talk here about anti-Semitism in France, page 140. Indeed, since the year 2000, anti-Semitism in France has been epidemic. Synagogues have been burned down, schools vandalized, shops attacked, rabbis beaten, children assaulted, school buses shot at, gravestones knocked over and defaced with swastikas and the name of Hitler. At Muslim demonstrations, shouts of death to the Jews have become common. One thing I've noticed is that while Americans speak of Jews, or more often Jewish people, Europeans usually say the Jews. On March 29, 2002, a dozen or so young men in masks smashed 2 stolen cars into the doors of a synagogue in Lyon and set the cars on fire. That same weekend, synagogues in Strasbourg and Marseille were burned down. Shortly thereafter, Molotov cocktails were thrown at several other French synagogues. In March 2003, 3 men in masks carved the Star of David into the arm of a Jewish girl in Aix-en-Provence. AIX-EN province. In the spring of 2004, a rabbi's 17-year-old son was assaulted outside his home in a Paris suburb by attackers shouting anti-Semitic slurs. A week later, an assailant shouting, Allah Akbar, you know that. He puts in parentheses here, he clarifies God is great, but we all know it now, don't we? Stabbed another 17-year-old Jewish boy in the chest in another suburb of Paris. The stabbing took place just as the young man was leaving a Jewish school. Perhaps the most striking thing about this news item was that it was based on information provided by local officials on condition of anonymity. The local officials said, we'll tell you about this, but we don't want you to name us. Note this well, says the author. The officials in question were not offering their opinions on Islam or anything else. They were simply providing the basic facts of a criminal case. Yet even in stating those facts, they would not go on the